Lockdown restrictions in England will remain in place until at least the 8th of March, when schools in...
The crisis has impacted so many industries this year as the virus forced businesses across the country to close their doors. Mom and Pop
Street is booming. Main Street is suffering. Almost 100,000 small businesses permanently closed since the pandemic.
Our analyst Susan Anderson estimates that annual earnings will fall an average of 18% for the specialty retailers in her coverage.
Like being in a store to make purchases, you could be pretty disappointed in the next coming weeks. We're hearing about more retailers, from clothing stores to drugstores, closing their doors for good. Pier 1 is just the latest.
But I feel as if this pandemic has largely been invented for taking the top 10% into the top 1% and taking the rest of the 90% downward. There was a study by the Robin Hood Foundation that came out today that said 32% of people in New York have been forced to go to a food bank.
Coming out of the UK, that there will be more likely to be at least as many, if not more, preventable cancer deaths than COVID deaths because of the diversion of resources into COVID and the panicking of everybody about it. And so we read Richard Sullivan, Professor of Cancer and Global Health at King's College London, Director of its Institute for Cancer Policy, saying, "The number of deaths due to the disruption of cancer services is likely to outweigh the number of deaths from the coronavirus itself. The cessation and delay of cancer care will cause considerable avoidable suffering. Cancer screening services have stopped, which means we will miss our chance to catch many cancers when they are treatable and curable, such as cervical, bowel, and breast. When we do restart normal service delivery after the lockdown is lifted, the backlog of cases will be a huge challenge to the healthcare system." We read October 6th in the Daily Mail coming out of the UK that Health Secretary Matt Hancock says cancer patients may only be guaranteed treatment if COVID-19 stays under control.
A major part of the U.S. economy. Nearly a quarter of them remain closed. Katrina Paris and Mark Pinn, who have lived in New York City's Harlem for more than 20 years, had to shut down their small lifestyle gift shop Nilu for 4 months.
We heard a United Nations report in April saying that economic hardship generated by the radical interruptions of commerce could result in hundreds of thousands of additional child deaths in 2020. UNICEF later increased that number to 1.2 million child deaths. And at Oxford University, Professor Sunitra Gupta has reminded us several times in recent weeks and months of the UN's prediction that as many as 130 million people could be at risk of starvation because of the lockdowns, because of the possibility of famine.
The last decade or so, that global capitalism is in a deep crisis. It's both a structural crisis, and it is also a crisis of state legitimacy and of capitalist hegemony. And this pandemic did not cause the crisis. It only made it vastly escalate and revealed it to the whole world. And it's going to aggravate all of the dimensions of the crisis.
Hello folk, how you doing? Scotty. When it comes to ignorance, there is no subject that rivals the study of economics on this front. No subject faces up to a greater deal of ignorance than the subject of economics, and you can certainly hear this from the amount of ignorance you hear about that of capitalism.
As the world reacts to the coronavirus pandemic, analysts are warning of ways the crisis can be exploited. We are calling this disaster capitalism.
The term disaster capitalism stems from a book that was written by Naomi Klein, who tried to pass off South America as being strongly capitalist. Of course, she took someone like Milton Friedman way out of context. About the only country that you could turn to and you could argue had lived under at least some extent of capitalism was Chile between 1985 to the mid-2000s, until of course you saw the government intervention and moved more towards the mixed economy. However, when you look at all these other countries like Brazil or Venezuela, or even if you talk about Cuba had gone through years of political and economic fascism and then moved in the direction of communism. It's no different if you look at the countries like that of Brazil. Brazil faced a level of economic and political fascism through military dictatorships and then led in the direction of this to do with, socialism, and it's gone through a cycle between the two, and she tries to pass this off as capitalism.
32% of people in New York have been forced to go to a food bank because of food insecurity since the beginning of the pandemic. So think about this, Adam. You're just as likely in New York State right now, what we think of as the capital or the state that sort of embodies America. You're just as likely to run into someone on the street who's had to go to a food bank than someone who has a college degree.
If you've ever wondered why you never hear these people complaining about the welfare state, but they'll complain about the food banks, it's because they've got an agenda. Their agenda is to use the welfare state to further their agenda of redistribution of wealth, all in the name of socialism. Of course, there's an issue with people going on food banks, and there's poverty, there's unemployment, etc. But isn't it convenient how he tries to pass this off as a capitalist system, when in real fact, what it is a mixed economy? Now, even when I pointed out before about the period of deregulation under Ronald Reagan, it was minute in the grand scale of things, and you can see that here. Even under Donald Trump, it would have been minute in the grand scale of things. Because the reality is, even if you were to go by 1960s levels, it's still over-regulated. So he wants you to believe that somehow you're living under a capitalist system today when you're not. You're living under corporatism. In other words, it's the merger between state and corporate power, where of course the giant corporations are in bed with government and they're lobbying government for special interest favours to use more government regulation to beat out the competition of smaller business people. It's anti-capitalist, in other words. It's a system that's inherently collectivist in many regards, because if you look at that of society, you're forced into a collective group and you're forced to collectively pay a tax. Capitalism is an individualist system. If anybody understands the definition of individualism and understands what individualism is about, it's clear what it means. Even the dictionary can point to you that it means about the freedom from government interference, the freedom for the market to regulate itself. In other words, it's basically referring to that of the free market economy. You hear countless concessions. There's even a concession you can hear here.
American healthcare is largely privatised and lacks pricing regulation, both key traits of a capitalist system.
So as you can hear there from the concession, they'll never be honest. But of course you can catch them out on these things. It basically defines the free market. They acknowledge that. They just don't want to admit up to it. That's what capitalism's about. How the hell they can then say, oh, capitalism's the cause of the crisis, given the very fact that you're living under a mixed economy, your private sector's over-regulated by the state, which I've already pointed out. It's a ridiculous argument. They're basically trying to blame capitalism for what's never the fault of capitalism.
In terms of good governance, in terms of social safety, that cannot be compromised on. This is a virus that doesn't respect borders. It crosses borders, and as long as it is in full strength in any part of the world, it's affecting everybody else.
So what these socialists are trying to do is, and it's part of the World Economic Forum, is that every time a crisis comes along, they want to try and project the blame all off onto capitalism, which is laughable, given the very fact that these lockdowns is government restrictions. Since when did government restrictions become that of free market capitalism? It's as laughable as these people who said that capitalism was responsible for the banking crisis. Most importantly, conveniently, none of these people touch upon the very fact that capitalism is about free market money. That means money that's determined by the people of society. That was your gold standard. Now where is it? Of course, they don't touch upon that because it was fraudulently taken from you.
Now, who needs to be told that they're suffering from the effects of COVID-19? Well, nobody, I suspect, because we're all feeling the pain to some extent, not just in health terms, but in the way we live, in jobs, and so on, in our everyday lives. Is it time to ask how the global economic system got us here in the first place?
For those of you who don't realise, he's basically referring to capitalism. He thinks that somehow this is the capitalist system today. Quite laughable to say the least, given the fact that we've seen years of public ownership of things like the fire service, that of police, healthcare, education. How on earth can this person be taken seriously when he sits and tries to call public ownership capitalism? If you were to go on about the issues of the healthcare and education costs, etc., and all your private sector costs today being through the roof. In other words, what these ignoramuses did was they restricted the market, they restricted supply, and they increased demand. Now, anybody who understands prices and understands basic economics knows that prices are signals. The higher price in the market's a price signal to tell you there's a shortage. So in other words, the serious crisis is not the fault to do with, oh well, it's to blame on private ownership. What's private ownership got to do with it? And it's not true private ownership anyway.
Capitalism has grown to the point where it's basically taken over the world. The idea of universal basic incomes, the way it ties in is, if instead of being completely beholden to this system, where you either take the job that's offered or you're in trouble, today, unless you're in a non-contracted tribe on an island, you have to get everything through capitalism. You have to get a job, earn money, buy your things. You don't have a choice otherwise. So that's the idea behind the book.
To be fair to this guy, he seems well-intentioned and of course good-hearted. He just doesn't understand what he's talking about. And I can sympathise because you can tell by body language he's not really that confident in what he's saying, because he doesn't really fully understand. I can sympathise with that. But when you go on to these type of people who are very sarcastic in how they talk, you know, they speak as if they know a lot of what they're talking about, and they try to speak about that of economics and they know absolutely nothing about it, then of course there's the serious issue. It was through all the socialist fractional reserve banking, of course, that they tried to project off onto capitalism. In other words, basically encouraging government borrowing and spending. And the words of Ben Bernanke, who was a former chairman of the Federal Reserve, for crying out loud, who mentions about the encouragement of government borrowing and spending. What was government borrowing and spending got to do with capitalism? Nothing. Capitalism is about the free market. It's about private businesses and the exchange in the marketplace. And the only way an exchange can take place in a capitalist system in a free market is through voluntary exchange. Both parties have to agree upon the exchange. That's the only way in a capitalist system an exchange can take place.
Everyone is afraid of the hospital bills that come from going to a hospital. So we don't go. We could break our leg, we wouldn't go. People just like, oh, Uncle Joey down the street, he fixes the legs. Go to him.
Again, it goes on to this whole thing to do with the healthcare issue. How many people I've came across who seem to think that the American main healthcare market is somehow capitalist. It is unbelievable.
We want an end to the profit at all costs mentality, because if we don't build an economic future with people at the centre in a sustainable frame where we are respectful of our planetary boundaries and the need to change our energy and technology systems to have a living planet for human beings. The world could fund it right now, and yet 70% of the world's people have no social protection. That's respectful of public services and not simply trying to make profit of them.
Again, all you're listening to is basically that to do with a communist who doesn't understand the first thing of which she's even banging off about. She's basically trying to claim that you put people at the centre when really you're talking about public ownership in practice. Putting government at the centre, not the people. It's always been the government. The government is the one that nationalises. The government is the one that needs to tax in order to pay for the public sector. And you need to tax the private sector, so you need a private sector there in order to finance the public sector. She mentions about that to do with profits. Again, it's the economic illiteracy folk. These people don't even know what profits mean. See, if you oppose profits, you basically oppose the people. If you don't understand that, well, you've never studied prices in your life. She then harps off about this to do with the environment, which is quite laughable to say the least. Again, folk, you could go and check out my videos on the economic calculation problem. I've explained about that to do with profits and losses. I've even explained about the economic calculation problem more in depth, and you could hear my argument for the problem that socialism's faced with resource misallocation, because if you don't have market-driven prices, if you don't have the information of profits and losses, there is no possible way for you to work out how much resource to use, what resources to use, or where to allocate them, how the resources are transported, and most importantly, without the information of profits and losses, how the hell are you supposed to work out how to technologically improve? That's the very reason why, when you looked at Cuba, with the outdated cars since the 1950s, that was not a fashion statement, folk. And it was no different in Great Britain with the nationalisation. It's why Britain had the outdated trains when it came to British Rail.
If profit wasn't put before people, would the pandemic have been so bad?
Folk, this idea that profits come before people is really ignorant, it's economically illiterate, it's stupid, to be quite frank with you. Profits is driven by people. It's the people who tell you what your profits are. That is to say that prices are signals. So in other words, when it comes to profits is consumers' needs and wants. What value is there to a capitalist to produce whatever the hell they like and throw it out there in the market? There's no value. Because there is the risk that whatever the capitalist produces, puts it out there in the market, you've no guarantee that it's going to sell. You can live in this theoretical fantasy world all you want, where you think capitalists can just produce whatever the hell they like, but that's not the real world. They are forced into the economic reality that goods will only sell at a price for what the consumer is willing to pay for it.
Capitalism is meant to be full body contact violence and competition to unleash incredible prosperity such that we can be more empathetic and loving with our brothers and sisters across the nation. And it feels as if our collective efforts right now are to be more empathetic and loving with companies than with people. We've figured out a way to keep restaurants open. We've figured out a way to bail out small businesses and flatten the curve for rich people, but we haven't figured out a way to keep schools open. I mean, think about this. The two largest asset classes in America, real estate and the stock market, are at all-time highs.
The first thing that they think of when it comes to capitalism is finances, and that's it. And the stock market, of course. He's gone on about government subsidies, for crying out loud, which is bloody socialism. In other words, socialising the losses of others, and completely ignores the fact that capitalism is about individualism. That means individuals having the financial independence over their own money to choose what they do with their own money, forcing society into a collective group, having stripped them of their individual rights and liberty, and then somehow subsidising the losses of others, and somehow they pass that off as capitalism.
I believe it is very important for countries to recognize that, there are some essential services that need to be provided in terms of healthcare, in terms of education.
Isn't that rather quite convenient that you would mention about that? Isn't it funny how along comes a pandemic with all these lockdowns, by the way, that was government restrictions, that along comes these arguments for socialism. We need, because a virus doesn't know any borders, then, we need nationalisation, because apparently nationalisation will fix the problem. Great Britain has been sitting with the British NHS. Now, since 1948, the NHS has been faced with massive big long waiting lines every single decade on record. It's been faced with the surplus waste problems, the medical staff shortage problems. It's been faced with all sorts through all the decades of its existence, right back to 1948. The NHS in Scotland is a devolved issue. Scotland is only a population of 5 million people, and yet Scotland's NHS has been in crisis for years. The long waiting lines and the surplus waste problems, the shortage of medical staff and the shortage of hospital beds has been around long before the pandemic. So no one can turn around and use the excuses and say, it's only because of the PFI deals, the private finance initiatives. That's the reason why. Really, that's quite interesting, because the Netherlands, all their hospitals are privately run. When it came to your idea of this centralised utopia, which of course was your wet dream, the European Union Soviet Socialist Republic, which Britain used to be a part of, thankfully, they were far behind us when it came to vaccinations. Britain, as you can see from the statistics, left the EU SSR miles behind. Now, what did the EU SSR try to do in response to that? Despite people's lives being at risk, the EU SSR tried to restrict Britain getting further vaccinations so that they could, keep up. Rather quite funny, that is. When people's lives are at risk, They want to restrict the quantity that Britain can get, all in the name because Britain gave them a showing up. Now, if that doesn't tell you the true face of these globalists of the EU-SSR, what does? There's even this article, you can check this out for yourself, where the EU-SSR tries to hide the truth. Of course, the EU-SSR was only for its own self-interest, holding Britain back. But now that we've left the customs union and a single market, according to your logic, we would have been worse off. Honestly, it's laughable that your type claims that socialism is the answer, given the record of failure of socialism across the entire planet Earth. It's not like we haven't got the evidence there to prove it. We saw the failure of your socialism that led to the banking crisis, because your socialism fixed the interest rates below market value and created the boom and bust cycle. You didn't like that one, did you? Because you tried to blame it on capitalism, didn't you? Oh, yes you did. Just like how you and your kind ran around saying deregulation caused the banking crisis. What the hell do you call that then, eh? Does that look like deregulation caused the banking crisis?
So this requires global cooperation to deal with it. Countries, they have to find ways of raising revenues. And progressive taxation could be one form of it. We talked about solidarity tax that may be needed in some countries.
It's the idea that somehow you can have a high level of productivity and have super high tax rates at the same time, all in the name of solidarity. When you raise the tax rates under your solidarity tax, it means you're producing less. And when you're producing less, and you're going to be faced with a serious problem here, it means the costs of your goods and services drive up. Who does that pass off onto? That's right, the solidarity of the consumer. So much for the solidarity tax, eh? It hurts the poor. That your solidarity tax is really just a tax to fund your own pockets, to basically fill your own pockets with it. That's really what it is. That's what you're saying.
Nature strikes in ways that we cannot imagine, and we've seen one. And climate change is, could be even worse. And so we have to prepare for that.
And there you have it, folk. The real rationale behind this whole thing. It's all about globalism. All about taking control and centralising it into one hand, into the pockets of government. A big nanny government under the name of the United Nations, the one world government. This idea of climate change. Is that why, more than 2,000 years ago, when the Roman Empire existed, the average temperature on planet Earth was far hotter than it is today? And then that's what you call science.